This is Brad with Blue Nile Farm. If you're into purchasing hay or making hay, a lot of times we talk about different bale size, 4x4 bales, 4x5 bales, 5x6 bales. And a lot of people ask how many squares are in a round bale. And that's one of their common concerns. And what we're going to talk about today is not specifically about that, but we're going to talk about hardcore versus softcore. Because depending on if it's a hardcore bale or a softcore bale are also going to play a major factor in how many squares you're going to get out of that round. So if you're a buyer of hay, this is something you really need to pay attention to. If you are a person that tries to sell hay, also pay attention to this too. But if you're just making hay for yourself, it really doesn't matter if you make hardcore or softcore round bales. It really is not going to matter because your whole goal is to feed it out. But this is something everybody should pay attention to because this gives you a gauge on how much hay you actually need for the year. So stay tuned, we're going to cover it. So there's a lot of different companies that make round balers. There's Krone, there's John Deere, there's Case, there's New Holland, you know, and the list goes on and on. And the problem is that each baler manufacturer uses a different system. They're relatively close, but they're also different. Some are belt balers like this that run by belts. And basically, as it picks up the hay, it just kind of squeezes it tighter and tighter using belts. Some are chain balers. Some are known as fixed chamber balers. And some are also known as variable balers. So there's different types of balers that are out there. Some of them you can increase the pressure to, some you can't. So when a bale is made, they're generally made by different sizes, 4x4, 4x5, 5x6, and so on. And that's fine and dandy, but the problem is the density of that bale is going to dictate the quantity of square bales you would get if you unwrap that. So a lot of us want to question how many squares are around all the time. And it all depends on that density level. So that's what we're going to cover. And I just wanted to show you the different types of balers that are out there because that makes a difference. And today, as I go through this, I have bales from 4 different types of balers. I have a Case baler, I have a New Holland baler, I have a John Deere baler, you know, and one baler I don't even know what it was. And that made my softcore bale. So with that said, let's go on and I'll kind of show you different bales and what we're talking about, hardcore versus softcore. So let me show you a bale that I produce with my little John Deere 447 baler. Now what I like about this baler is that it makes really tight bales. And I rebale, and I'm going to tell you this is produces, if they're exactly about, you know, their max size of 4x4, they will produce almost 12 square bales per bale, almost guaranteed. And these bales are tight. You know, you can't even get your fingers in here. And even if you stick a probe in, a lot of times you're fighting to get in here. But this is a real, what's called a hardcore bale, tight. And you can tell by its spiral direction, whether it goes to the left or the right, depending on the side you're looking at. It'll be spiral. You're not going to see much room. Even in the core here, you can't even get your fingers deep in here because it's so tight. That's ideal, in my opinion, because when I rebale, I like a tight bale because the way it comes off, it doesn't come off in big, large sheets and doesn't plug up that often, rarely. Number 2 is I like feeding out because, you know, they're tight and it keeps the moisture from getting inside the bale. And lastly, it's producing the most hay I can in the best space. And when I stack them, they stay relatively round because they're very tight. That's another benefit of that. Sometimes I've had bales sitting down and I go about 4 high and they're squashed down at the bottom because they're soft core. So this is one from a John Deere baler. So this is hay that I get from a guy that I've been dealing with for years, and he makes 4x4 bales, and I believe this comes from a Case baler, but I do not know the actual model number. But his bales are still hardcore bales, but they're a little bit softer than mine. They're not as tight. And you can see that mostly going into the core. You can kind of move it around and get your fingers in here. And this bale will produce about exactly 10 squares per round. Never goes above 10. It's pretty much traditionally, this is what I get every time I get his hay, and I know that's the average of the way these bales are made. So, but this is another example. So let's go look at a 4x5 bale and compare those. And they both are net wrapped that I'm going to go over as well. These are all string tied. So here are some 4x5 bales I got from my buddy. He makes 4x5 bales. He is a New Holland baler. I think it's a 7060. And relatively for each 4x5 that I get from him, these things produce about 17 square bales out of every round. So I'm pretty happy with that for the money that I'm paying. But again, this is again another example of a hardcore bale, just because again you can see the spiral and it may be a little bit softer inside the core, but this is pretty tight. I mean, this is actually a lot tighter than the 4x4 bale made by the Case. But this is a tight bale. You can barely get your fingers in here. And, you know, this is something that I'm looking for, and this is something I like. And again, when you rebale, if you're into rebaling, you're going to like tighter bales because it's not going to flake off as much. So let's go to our last bale, and it's going to be a soft core. So these are soft core bales, and how do you know this? It's basically by what you see in the center. You're going to notice that they're kind of like star shaped, or they're a little bit more spread out. And this one's more star shaped. You can see how it's not tight in the center. So when you see something like this, then you know it's a soft core. Here's another better example. This bale right here, from a distance, you can clearly see its design. It's kind of not tight, and it's kind of like a star shape. This is a telltale sign of a soft core bale. And you should also realize that with a soft core bale, you know, you can actually get your hand inside a bale like this. And if you can do this, you're definitely going to have a hay loss. Now also, if you're putting this in your barn and you have a moisture meter, because they're looser, they're said that they dry out better and it's a little easier, they're more stable. But the thing is with a moisture meter is you're probably going to show a lot less moisture on your meter because they're not tight. And I've learned that if you have real tight bales and you stick a moisture meter in, if they're tight bales, they're going to be higher in moisture, maybe even 16, 17%, whereas I can take make the same hay with a soft core, and the soft core might only show it's 10 or 12% moisture on the same field. So you're going to have higher moisture content with the moisture meters with hardcore bales than you would with softcore. That's just something to pay attention to as well. And that's kind of where the moisture meters are tricky. You can't guarantee them 100%, but it's something that you should consider as well as maintain temperature. So when we deal with hardcore or softcore bales, you know, if you're selling the hay by the bale, then hardcore versus softcore may be something you have to pay attention to when you talk about yields. But one thing I want to clarify though, and there's a lot of parts of the country that sell hay by the weight, and that's normally sold by the ton. If you're buying and selling hay by the ton, then it really doesn't make a difference whether you have a hardcore or softcore bale because the weight's going to make the difference. The other thing too is with softcore bales, they have advantages. I don't want to put them down at all because there are certain things that they're good for. If you have a spinner and you just spin hay out for your cattle or other livestock, you know, the looser the bale is, the easier it is on a spinner. So that's where I think a softcore bale may work out pretty good as long as it stays on the spinner, it'll shoot through. If you have a hay on roller, you know, I would think that would also be an advantage if you have a softcore bale. Because the problem with the hardcore bales is they don't always feed out that easy. And that's the only downfall to them, in my opinion. But for rebaling, I don't want to have too much hay come out, so I'd rather have a tight bale. With that said, though, like I said, bales are either sold by the piece or if they're sold by the ton. And again, if you're selling by the bale, that's where you really need to pay attention to hardcore versus softcore, in my opinion. So the real reason why you need to understand what a hardcore bale is versus a softcore is the yield of hay that you're going to get out of that round bale. So again, when you're asking yourself how many squares are in a round, if you have a softcore bale, you're going to be definitely on the lower side of production. So if I tell you that on a 4x5 bale, you can get anywhere from say 13 to 14 bales up to 17, 18 bales. So 13 to 18, okay, and that's a pretty big difference. But mostly on the softcore, you're more likely to get 14 square bales out of a round bale at a 4x5 size if it was a softcore. But if you had a hardcore bale, you're probably pushing 17 to 18 squares out of a round. So if you're purchasing that bale at a certain dollar denomination, you calculate the hay costs in your area, you're going to find out if you're making a good deal or a bad deal. When I buy hay, a lot of times, you know, and I'm in the rebaling process, especially if I buy 4x4 bales, you don't have a lot of variation. And I've had some softcore 4x4 bales, and they only produce about 9 squares out of a round, you know, versus mine that's producing 12. Well, and you're saying, well, it's only 3 bales. Well, at $6 a bale, that's $18 difference. Well, if I'm paying, say, $40 for a round bale, that's $18 and I'm losing that I can't get back. But if, say, I'm paying $25 for a round bale, I'm definitely making profit. It's just how much more profit I'm going to make. So really what it comes down to is you're always going to have lesser hay with a soft core bale versus a hardcore bale. And you just need to identify that, and it'll make you successful in your purchases. With that said, thanks for watching. Hopefully you gained a little knowledge about this, and I'll see you guys soon.